Welcome to the Roundtable for September. It's nice to see you guys again. And the topic this time is more along the lines of data privacy and with the context of surveillance capitalism, which is a concept which was brought about by Shoshana Zuboff. And it's a very interesting concept, and it's something that's very relevant in today's scenario where data is being collected and sold in order to understand the behavior of the consumer, and some may say to a certain extent modify such behavior in order to prefer their product. So this is the roundtable for the same, and I would like to with the start off with the questions as to what is surveillance capitalism and do we have any laws surrounding the same. So who would like to kickstart this discussion today?
I can take that. I can talk about what surveillance capitalism is. So basically, surveillance capitalism describes a market driven process where the commodity for sale is your personal data, and the capture and production of this data relies on mass surveillance of the internet. It's basically a new model of economic production, essentially, that takes the data and creates a product out of that. And this activity of economic production is usually carried out by companies that provide us with free online services or through apps, such as search engines, which are Google, social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, all of these things. So personal data has emerged as a dominant and valuable asset in today's day and age. And prior to this, no one had leveraged it better, but then these tech giants who are now doing it today. So these companies essentially collect and scrutinize our online behavior, our likes, dislikes, searches, social networks, and our purchases to produce data that can be further used for commercial purposes. And it's often done without us understanding the full extent of this surveillance. So surveillance capitalism basically is this business model on the digital world, which is reliant on big data to make money. The data then is used in this process is often collected by the same group of people who will ultimately be its targets. It's collected from us and it's used on us. So as you said, Shoshana Zuboff was the one who coined this term. And she's talked about that previously data was only used to improve the quality of search results. But anything beyond this, the data was needed only, the data was only constituted as a surplus, which signaled to Google about how people were behaving. But this behavioral data surplus could then be used for targeted advertising to individual users, which allowed Google to make increasingly accurate predictions about how users would behave. So the problem is that all this knowledge is about us, but it is not for us. It's used to fabricate predictions of our behavior that are sold to business customers. This began with online targeted ad markets, but now has migrated through the normal economy. This is what like Shoshana Zuboff's take on surveillance capitalism was. And instead of the democratization of knowledge, we have now got an asymmetry of knowledge. We thought we would have, let's say, access to proprietary knowledge, but it's just the opposite has happened. Proprietary knowledge owned by these companies now has complete access to us without resistance or friction because we don't even know it's happening. So that's like the overarching idea of what surveillance capitalism is.
Yes, thank you for that, Amisha. So that was very informative. And who would like to add on to it and comment on who owns this data that we just spoke about and who should own the said data, the person, the behavioral data of an individual? So does anybody have any opinion on the ownership of the data that was just spoken about, considering the fact that it's being taken and sold between companies? Whose is it to sell in the first place? Yes, Shreya.
I mean, when it comes to surveillance capitalism, the fear isn't per se owning and selling data, because if you think about it, data is essentially what we know about a consumer, and what we know about a consumer has been a part of the marketplace for since markets have existed. The problem occurs here is when predictions are being made at the amount that they're being made and the kind of data that is available about us uh, without our explicit consent. This is all a part of a system that coerces our consent. So that's where the issue arises about who owns our data. Because if you think about it, information about us is being stored by human beings who, I mean, our family, our friends, everyone in a social circle has information about us, which they store in their heads. The issue occurs here is the amount of data that they can store and the fact that they can trade on this data as commodities. Uh, so, I mean, again, and going back to the idea of surveillance capitalism,
Mm.
while there's a certain nefarious association that surveillance capitalism houses, which in many parts is valid because it is nefarious to a certain extent, but a lot of it is also something to do with homo economicus, which is the idea that these companies, they're trying to do what is best for them. And the issue I feel arises when it comes to when we think about them in the context of states, especially, and their relationships with state building, is the fact that they block legislation that would protect consumers, and while also talking about how it is impossible to create legislation about the internet or about the data is completely stored. And I feel like this is also an area that requires a lot of questioning if anyone wants to take it forward.
All right, thank you for that. Yes, Arvind.
So while talking about more of a moral question, I'm audible, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So while talking about the moral question about who should own data, who ought to own data, how much can it be regulated and things like that. Usually when we go through a very vacuum kind of space where we don't have much information or future knowledge about or experience about future problems that might arise, usually the approach taken is an exclusionary approach, not an inclusionary approach, wherein we put out or exclude factors who can't own data, who cannot monopolize on these things. Instead of making who can, the question ought to be who cannot own data at the end of the day. So while excluding people, we can come to some kind of consensus about the general thing. So if you take, for example, Indian laws was one of the thing, right? So let's first understand, moving to the laws of evolution of laws in India. Of course, it would have been better if someone has an international perspective, because much more developed countries are developed, spoken about or taken steps on privacy laws, much more stronger laws before us. So if anyone has international perspective on laws, I would like to ask them to start first. Then we can talk about evolution in India. Do anyone of you have anything to contribute?
Right. Before we
Yeah,
come
like,
to that, Shreya, do you want to add on to the ownership or the legal aspect of the?
no, I think let's cover the legal aspect in a moment or two. But I want to add on something related to information asymmetry. Amisha, can you
Shreya,
elaborate?
I'm sorry, Shreya, go. I wanted to speak before you go first. I'm so sorry to
Okay,
interrupt.
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to highlight this concept that was in the Silicon Valley known as permissionless innovation. So whatever development is happening in this area, so the rights, the person who owns that information, who sort of from whom it is being extracted, that person does not consent to such information being used. And so, for example, right now there are Apple watches that are out there. So maybe your step count is calculated, everything is calculated, and even nowadays the credit score of a person is determined through the data that is collected upon that person. So even if we look, there is another concept known as digital dispossession. So the human beings that basically own that data from whom it is being extracted, they are being dispossessed of that data through this sort of commercialization of whatever data they are producing. So that was a point I wanted to like highlight. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Amisha.
Yeah, so this also is related to the question Shreya had raised about information asymmetry, and if I could elaborate on that, and a little to do more with the technical aspect of who owns our data. So at the very outset, it's a tricky question to answer because there is a lot of debate on this as to who exactly owns our data, because you cannot like pinpoint one person who does that. Because in today's day and age, most businesses rely on cloud-based computing for access of essential applications and even for storing data. And you have softwares such as the enterprise resource planning and customer relationship management, all of which rely heavily on artificial intelligence and cloud-based computing systems. So what ends up happening is whenever we either use an application, etc., something called the EULAs, which are the end user license agreements, and these are those long text heavy agreements that come up on a page that we just like scroll down and press agree to, and we usually assume that these text heavy documents are for people, are essentially to protect the rights of people, but they don't really protect the rights. They are agreements written to protect the vendor or the owner of that particular software. And this is where the question of data ownership arises. So the data is constantly traveling from one entity to another because it's an economy, it's a production economy. So it's very, very hard to come down to the point about who's owning it. So essentially, a lot of scholars have argued that the ethos of each company dictates how your personal information makes its way around the internet. So let's say if the company that you're getting involved with is someone who wants to protect data rights, maybe they will only share absolutely essential information with someone else, or they will share it in a manner that it doesn't breach your privacy or any of the things that you've not really agreed for. But in today's day and age, the entire idea is more about is about money. It's about profits. So to that degree, privacy comes at a lower level, or your data protection comes at a much lower. If I have to put them into a hierarchy, money was much more important. Profits are much more important, and this production economy is such that your data protection totally depends on how your company is. So it's very hard to say who owns your data, because it's continuously flowing in this production economy. So that's a tricky question, and I think academicians have not been able to come to an answer. So I doubt whether we'll be able to find one today as well. But yeah.
Absolutely. So now, building on that question, since nobody knows, I would like to ask, so what are the laws and the practices that exist around this data today, considering the fact that it's a debate that's still ongoing and that has not been answered yet? What is the current scenario? So, Arvind, you wanted to talk about the laws. I think you can bring up the laws that you wanted to.
Is it okay if international perspective are given?
Yes, of course.
If anyone can, yeah.
Oh, you want the international perspective?
Yeah, like I'm not prepared per se. So if
But that's all
anyone
right.
has
You
to
can talk about the
contribute with
Indian
that.
context if you have the Indian.
Yeah, sure. So okay, fine. Yeah. So moving forward, so in India, especially given that only after the geo revolution, internet has become a big part of our life. So I wouldn't say it wasn't before, but this has drastically increased or given a lot of surge, has seen a lot of surge in after geo revolution. So data protection laws in India started around October, like the talks about it started around October 2012, where during the Congress time, Planning Commission had put forth AP Shah Committee, which came up with 9 core areas of privacy protection, like how to give consent, how should be consent gathered, purpose limitation, things like that. The next came for like 2014, NDA government came. They were much more data driven because they had this other inclusion that was one of their voting manifesto. So they essentially tried to silence these data protection laws because they wanted all these people to be included into the system of the government system. So they essentially silenced most of the talks around it. So Shreya, do you want to contribute to something?
Yeah, so I want to highlight that basically we've had different steps of data protection, right? So although we did have like a Supreme Court judgment with the Putteswamy that talked about right to privacy, and that was sort of brought in like for protection of people's data, and there are judgments and there are like acts like the Information Technology Act, and there's certain portions on it but they only focus on protecting the sensitive data of a person. Supposedly their sexual orientation or maybe their biometric data. So the ambit is not very broad. It basically shows, for example, government agencies do have access to our data, and they are not basically bound by a lot of things that the IT Act usually protects us from. So they can easily intercept our data, they can monitor it, they can decrypt it, and basically they can generate information from whatever they can gather. Now there are certain sections within the IT Act like the section 66E that talks about punishment in case of violation of privacy or in case of identity theft. So there are laws, but the problem is that they sort of have a very small ambit. And then, although the government, again, as Arvind mentioned, did try to introduce a data protection bill, they stopped it halfway because, according to them, it was a little cumbersome and it was very complicated, and they wanted to like sort of think about it more. So they scrapped it again, and they were like, maybe we'll reintroduce it. So if we look at other countries outside of India, supposedly Brazil, Brazil did introduce a general personal protection data law, which was again in comparison to like other global south countries, they did a very big job. Like because mostly in EU we have certain data protection laws and most countries do not. So again, so India sort of did move a few steps ahead, but then because the data protection law that we planned to introduce, the bill got scrapped, so we did sort of move backwards after that. So yeah.
Actually, that was a very interesting point brought forth by Shreya. So, the major criticism about the data protection bill that was proposed, I'll come through the evolution, but the major criticism was that it was scrapped not only because it was complicated, but rather because they had the committee had given a bad kind of legislative bill framework, and the JSA committee, the joint committee of the parliament, had made it worse. So moving back to the evolution, I'll explain how that's worse. So 2012, 2014 NDA government comes. So 2017 is when Puttaswamy judgment came. So we all know that. So Puttaswamy recognized the right to privacy as a fundamental right. It also recognized right to be forgotten will fall under right to privacy. So it will also become a fundamental right. And finally, the most essential aspect that Puttaswamy did was it ordered a data protection framework that to be created by the government. It ordered the legislation to do that. And the second important aspect was that it also defined the exceptions to the right to privacy. On what basis can it be violated? The bounds of right to privacy. They said it on three grounds. One was legality, second was legitimacy, and third was proportionality. So legality is basically as we understand. So basic law which allows any violation. On what basis are you doing? So that should be a legal framework based on which an action is taken. Second thing would be legitimacy, the necessity of the said act, or is there any other way that has a lesser violation kind of a thing? And third thing is proportionality. Is the act proportionate to the amount of information you require? Is there any other easier way to take these things? So all these things should be decided while a violation is allowed for. So these are the things that Puttaswamy essentially put forth. And next came 2018, as 2017 it had recommended. B.N. Sri Krishna committee was formed, and that was the first time a proper committee was formed, and it had put forth a draft bill. That was the, as I said, the bad bill. It was actually better without, like, when there is nothing, there is something, right? So it was, though bad, there was some legal framework. This particular bill was put forth before the, so B.N. Sri Krishna committee was criticized to be heavily state supportive kind of a thing. So state was given a very much of an upper hand in the bill. And while put before this committee, which is joint committee of the parliament, they expected both the sides to have a conversation and create, there was some possibility of having a counter voice. So they expected some kind of reforms in the bill. But what ended up happening was in 2019 that came out. So what ended up happening was the JSA committee, JCP committee, put forth 81 amendments and 12 recommendations, which essentially challenged the entire mandate of the bill. So this is the evolution. So after this, the bill was withdrawn, saying that we need a lot of work around this. So let's, how to say, understand the bill first, what and all it said. So firstly, what are the stakeholders and the essential terms in the bill? Essentially, they said there is a data principal, who's the individual from whom the data is taken. There'll be a data fiduciary, Facebook and middlemen like that, who take data from us. And another important term was data localization. So basically, they divided data into three. So first they divided essentially into personal data and non-personal data, and personal data was divided into three. So first would be personal data, data which can be used to recognize a person, like name, address, all these things. Whereas next was sensitive personal data, which is like
I'm
biometric,
so
financial
sorry to
data.
cut you off, Arvind. I am so sorry to cut you off. This is very interesting, but like before we go into the details of the bill itself, I'd like to take Lovanshi's opinion up on the issue.
No, actually, let him complete. I mean, he was giving a really nice trajectory. I just had a comment, which I think can happen later. Let him complete. I'll make it later.
Oh,
It's,
go for
yeah,
it.
take it.
The three types of data.
Yeah. So personal data and non-personal data. Personal data was divided into three. So personal data, as I said, sensitive personal data would include biometric, financial data, medical information, and things like that. And third would be critical personal data, which was essentially not defined. So the difference between these three is that personal data was allowed. There was no particular limitation on personal data. This can be sent anywhere across like it can be collected from here and sent anywhere and processed anywhere around the world. But sensitive personal data, they had a check on it, which said it can be collected here, it can be transferred, but a copy of it should be from Indian servers. So if Google is taking information from here, they should have a personal, like business connection here. They should have a proper server here, which has a copy or saves data here also. Whereas in the critical personal data section, they said it cannot be processed or transferred to anywhere around India, and this was not defined. This was one of the major criticism, because it being not defined, it encourages all kinds of startups and anything, because state has the ultimate power to define anything and everything to be put into this critical data, and they will not be able to essentially transfer it and have only information here. And setting up servers in India will not per se give a lot of employment, but will take a lot of investment. So this way they were very much encouraged, and this was the first time anywhere around the world for huge tech giants to publicly voice out their condemn towards such a bill. So this was heavily criticized by all the startups and big tech giants here. So this was the essential structure. Let's come to the critique. So as I said, data localization. Data localization was one of the biggest problem, because as I said, it doesn't having localized servers cost a lot, and also doesn't give a lot of employment. So this will be hampering investment in the long term. And this will basically put our any economic opportunities down. And another one of the biggest criticism was clause 35, which essentially gave the absolute power to the government to access any type of data. So what happened here is that this clause 35, the absolute power, when combined with localization, what happens is that it leads to a totalitarian government, where government, without consent of any of these individuals, will have access to any type of data they want. And especially given that our government, we should have been much more careful with it. And this was criticized to be a very government-driven state totalitarian kind of regime. And this was the major reasons why this was put down. So actually, by withdrawing the bill, they have done a good thing to us, is my own personal opinion. Though something was better than nothing, but this nothing, if it's going in a negative way, that's going to be problematic. So this way, I feel it was good that we withdrawn a bill. At least something good could have been happening. So that's it from my side. I guess legal framework is covered.
Yes. 1 second. God. Yes, Lovanshi. What would you like to add to that? The question on the legality.
Right. I think Arvind secondly kind of laid down the framework and the legal aspect of it. Mostly he covered it, like I wanted to add those points, but later in the later half, he covered those as well. But I think what caught my attention was that this scrapped bill of this 2019 act, he made a like a argument that it might bring better, the scrap is like a big chair for us or like all the stakeholders, and it might bring out a better framework. But I believe like the some elements which this bill had, I don't think those fundamental elements our government would dilute. For example, a very controversial aspect of it was that the government will have like an unfettered access to the personal data in the name of a public order or sovereignty, which kind of turns India into a Orwellian state, but which we have to be like really careful about, because there is literally no barriers in their access or what they asked for it. And I think Arvind also mentioned about like how the parliament asked for like some amendments to the joint committee recommendations. So basically they brought like 81 amendments to it, and in that they kind of wanted to dilute down the barriers of their access to, I mean, in the towards the data of the users. And one such example which I read was about this Razorpay, which we know is like a payment gateway. They were actually compelled by the police to supply data to this fake news checkup channel. And although all the requirements of the investigation were carried out legally, but there wasn't any safeguard against that. What if they misuse that data? So this was just one such example. So imagine if the bill is come into picture, if the act does come into picture, then how much this would be an issue. Because if they are getting the data, there won't be any safety nets for their use or misuse in that angle. And if we talk about the other stakeholder, for example, the big tech companies like Amazon or Facebook, these intermediaries, they also raised their issues in a way that, because they were asked to track down the encrypted messages. Like WhatsApp was kind of, I think there's a legal battle going on between WhatsApp and Indian government, because they were kind of compelled to track down those encrypted messages. And also I think they were also I think Facebook was it that I mean Facebook and Twitter's, every now and then they are asked to bring down or like remove those posts which kind of shows dissent to our current government. And so that is also one way they kind of curb the dissent, by asking the intermediaries and slapping like huge fine to them if they don't do it. So that is one factor. And the I think data localization point was also very interesting, which I feel like Europe has this GDPR system, right, which give more autonomy to the owner of the data, that is a natural person, about their location, everything, like biometric markers and all that. But I feel the bill, of course, was very much not on that lines of GDPR regulations, but it is more tilting towards the China's data protection framework, in a way that which again gives a very unfettered access to the government, rather than the people or the private entities. So I feel like since our previous, so my coming back to my argument, since our this bill was very much not on the lines which we want, that like no more autonomy to people, I have like, I think we should, with a pinch of salt, we should take that thing that the next bill won't be radically different than what it was, right? So that was the underlying argument.
Yes, thank you for that. So I think we'll go with Shreya, Govind, and then Arvind, and then Shreya in that order next. And
Yeah, so I basically want to like highlight the point about the government and them imposing regulations. So basically, they have imposed certain regulations on social media companies, internet news services, and other firms. And they have this new legislation out there where, so you know the concept of VPNs, right? So VPNs basically allow you to sort of access like your, so basically your location would show of a different country. So if I use a VPN right now, so I could show my location to be United States of America. So the point is, the legislation of the government right now require VPNs to store user data and IP addresses for up to 5 years. So this allows the government to have more control and surveillance over the people. And the government is also planning to introduce an act known as Digital India Act, which focuses on, well, they say it focuses on women's safety and children's safety. And so they are basically controlling the kind of content that is shown on social media platforms like Amazon Prime or Netflix. And so the idea is that the government has been taking different kind of steps to increase their surveillance. And also, as we talked about the bill, so we could see like the correlation between the two. That's what I want to like talk about.
Yes, Arvind. Also, can we please keep this a little shorter because we still have a time limit to adhere to? So,
Yes, sure. So I was just wanting back to connect to the capitalist, what is that called?
surveillance capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism. So as we are talking, right? So it moved more on the totalitarian government kind of side. So why I brought about the morality aspect, who ought to own our data? It comes to the question that especially we are moving in a space where we do not have much experience, because especially internet world is very, very, very new, even to the entire world. And to, for even for example, industrial revolution, to have proper industrial laws, labor laws, and every other laws, it took us a century of work to do. Whereas internet is hardly 2 or 3 decades old in our case. So it takes, it might not, how to say, it might be too late, because when we charge a framework, so one thing we ought to be clear about is state cannot have the entire control over the thing. So as I said, going through the exclusionary way, state might should not have the entire this thing, because they also have the, it should be more like a democratic way where there should be counterbalances everywhere. So if a private party cannot be owning the entire data, they should not be led to exploit our data capitalist in a capitalist way. Similarly, in a totalitarian way, even the state shouldn't be allowed to enter the data, though we should be able to find a middle ground where there are counter voices everywhere and checks each and everywhere. So that's what, connecting to our entire discussion, all these Indian legislation points and things like that.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I feel the GDPR that the EU has kind of prioritizes the human condition over the control that the state has, or even the company has. And I feel like even Australia is following in similar footsteps with their legislations. The idea, I feel, the motivation behind legislations today doesn't have to be a struggle between the state and the market. It has to be about prioritizing the individual. I mean, it is a kind of a neoliberal argument, but it is in fact, I mean, as lawmakers, I feel like they need to be concerned with that rather than regulation. And at this point in time, the Indian government, when it comes to formation of legislation around digital spaces and digital privacy and data, they're more obsessed with controlling what is out there, and how they can frame it, like even with their curbing of OTT and controlling of what can be on OTT and how that's offensive, or in the case of how they want Twitter and Facebook to follow regulations, as Lovanchi pointed out about dissent, and how facets of dissent are being banned from the internet. So I feel in that capacity, the EU is doing a good job with their legislation. And in fact, who owns data, when we think about it, it the right has to be with the people, even when it has to be with the people who are authorizing it. It cannot completely be in the control of companies, or in our case of our government, because we are completely following China's model. And China's model is even scarier because the market and the state are one and the same there when it comes to digital spaces. So yeah.
Yes, Amisha.
Yeah, so I'd also like to circle back to the point about who owns our data. sorry, who should own our data. So it's as tricky as who owns our data. So superficially, if I were to answer that question, my first response would be, it's my data, I should have control over it. But I came across something quite interesting when I was looking up an answer to this question. And a lot of data experts have come to the point where they've said that when our personal data has very little market value, in that scenario, it's more ideal that we as users have a higher control over it. Because if you look at the cost benefit analysis, it's not very cost efficient for companies to really get into like evaluating and putting a valuation on that data and selling it as a product in this production economy. But in cases where there is significant market value, granting firms the right to exploit consumer data leads to the creation of enough value to compensate consumers for the inconvenience of using their rights. So like a very, very capitalist approach here, that at the end goal is money. So when there is not much money involved, you let people have control over their data. But when you get a lot of money out of it, then you can exploit the users and then you can compensate them for it. So again, this also brings us back to the dilemma that Shreya hinted towards, that what is more important, like a capitalist approach or a protectionist approach which will favor the people. And let's say, because we are in a capitalist world, and even public policy, like policy makers will also take into account what these companies want and the tech giants want, because whatever you say, they're a big part of our economy today. So if you allow companies, or let's say the capitalist market, to have control over the data, is that going to happen? If let's say that happens, how do you control the big brother from surveilling us or using it for themselves? And if you do allow these two, are you prioritizing that over our personal data? But then I'm sure there'll be a lot of people, let's be fair, there'll be a lot of people who will be open to the idea, like, take my data, have complete rights over it, but pay us in return. So how do you deal with these sections?
You have people who are ready to sell their organs off if you pay them in return. So
exactly my point. So how do you deal with those two sets of groups? I want to protect my right, but there will be someone else who says, give me the money and take all my rights away. So it's a very difficult dichotomy to deal with.
Right. So since we're on a time crunch, I would actually like to build up on what Amisha just spoke about and talk and further the conversation about the current system. So as we pointed out, there are a lot of issues in the current system and a lot of problems that can be faced in this dilemma. So I would actually like to ask what you would suggest the system should look like, or what you believe the most optimal structure would look like, or the features that it would consist of. So if you have any. Yes, Shia.
I feel this is something that even Zuboff points out in her book. It's how it's kind of when there is lack of change, that's the scariest. When you have big companies bullying governments into not making legislation, that's the scary bit. As long as we're urging our states and our companies to constantly challenge each other and constantly change with each other, I feel like that's the way to go. But if we are sitting in a static mode where we are just like waiting for either of them to take over and being like, no, the data is changing too fast, we can't keep up laws with it, I mean, that's not an argument. You have to fight to protect your citizens. And I feel as long as countries are focusing on that and states are focusing on fighting against them, and even and so are and companies are also in their own ethos, while they are of course trying to maximize their own profits, their ideas of starting these like meta, even meta for that matter, is the idea is connecting people. It started with that, and it did connect people to a certain extent. And I feel as long as we keep the discussion going, as long as we keep talking about this, as long as we keep challenging, I feel like we're on the right path. But as soon as we say stop fighting it, then that's kind of what we lose the fight on. And another thing that a couple of people from the data industries have talked about, a way to curb the amount of data stored is like literally access how much data companies can store. You find them, or because they're all profit making machines. But if you tell them that after this point in time you'll be paying hefty fines, it's expensive for them to store data, I feel like that is an aspect that, as machinery, like at state machinery should talk about. But again, yeah.
Thank you, Shreya. Yes, Lavanshi.
Right. I mean, I think what should be done, or what, I don't think it has a one plain single linear answer to it. But again, circling back to, who owns the data? Because I think that's where the debate starts, and that's where the solution might arrive as well. And I feel nobody owns the data per se, right? We have our data which we give them to the big tech companies and all these e-commerce sites or anywhere, right? And this data is not even owned by them. So the argument that the person should own the data, if we look at it from a practical lens, 1 second, I think there's someone at my door. I'm really sorry. Yeah. So owning, if an individual owns their data, they have, so I think on a practical basis, when we come across those privacy and terms and condition, we literally press I agree without even going through the terms and condition. And there have been so many instances that those dodgy apps we uses, or there are so many payment gateways that we have been using these days, which have some really problematic privacy guidelines, which we accepted. And I think in that process, we do give this ownership right to them, and we don't this the unawareness regarding our data and privacy rights or our data itself. I don't think giving the sole or absolute right to an individual will reap any fruits in that uh, right in that framework, because first of all, lack of awareness on that end, and these days people who are aware also, they don't really go into it and read about it, and like they wish to know about it. Or I don't know. I think we have seen those cookies also. It's like, yeah, I agree, right? But we're not knowing the implications of that. So the argument that the absolute right should be given or ownership should be given to the individuals also, I think, on a shaky ground. And coming to the, I think, very interesting argument was put forth by Amisha, where she was giving this very capitalistic notion of we can own the data, and then if we wish to sell it, we can, right? In terms of profit maximization. I think that is also, that might pose a issue again, because that I don't think we should term data as a commodity, but as data as an information, right? And free flow of information is important. So if you convert data into commodity where some people would like to trade it against some value, again, which will create a friction in that trade value and everything, it will obstruct that free flow of information, which I think, again, there would be some disastrous implication to that. So these are only 2 points I would like to make. I had to make in the.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Amisha.
Okay, so this is probably a rudimentary and also a utopian argument, I would say. But ideally, when we're looking at laws that govern such an issue, I think it's important to take into account the position of every stakeholder, whether it's individuals, whether it's these capitalists, big tech giants, etc., and the government. So I mean, I like, if whenever you bring out a bill, the fundamental problem is each, or at least one stakeholder has a problem with it. Either my rights are not being protected enough,
Hmm.
or let's say the government is not getting power to, let's say, carry out surveillance, or the capitalists are being like their day-to-day economy, like their day-to-day work is being hindered by such a bill. So an ideal one would be that would take into account each one's position, and by the very fact of taking into account all three positions, there is bound to be a problem. But that's still, like, I don't know, personally I think that will be some, like some semblance of a good approach, because it will satisfy every stakeholder. So you can probably, you might be able to come out with a bill if that happens, because every time you try to bring out a bill, at least one stakeholder will have issues with it, and you might have the bill being scrapped every single time. So I mean, let's think of a situation where we are being given rights over our data. Like there is sufficient protection, but there's also the scope that because let's understand the very fact that it is a very big production economy. Data surveillance and this our data being used, it's a big market. So you have to also take into account how badly or how severely it will affect the economy if you put a complete ban or like you try stopping this. One, it is not easy to stop unless we go into like 20th century where internet and apps and others didn't exist, because some way or the other data is being generated, it's being stored somewhere, and I personally don't have control over my data. I can only humanly keep tab on certain things. So let's imagine a place where you have given some rights to capitalists, but to ensure that it's working alongside the protection that you are guaranteed as an individual. But at the same time, you like, while the entire issue of the government having a lot of information to carry out surveillance, it's also important to allow that much scope to the government, because the more data we have, the more crimes that will happen in those respects. So that your data can easily be used by terrorists. That's very, very simple argument to give. You have lots and lots of crimes that have now come up because of the presence of such data. So some sort of powers also have to be vested in the government to control and like protect the so-called country or protect its citizens. So like it's hard. Like I don't know, I don't have an answer to this, but you have to take into account all three stakeholders here to really come down to one particular protection bill that may be more acceptable to everyone, and that, like, again, utopian, but that protects interests of each and every party, like each stakeholder here. So I think it's a long way for us to probably reach there, and you need a lot of academicians and other experts in this field to sit down for us to maybe research on this more, because I don't have an answer, but I think logically it makes the most sense to satisfy, if not completely, at least to some degree, each and every stakeholder, for us to really come down to a particular law that will be like in a country like India, where we will be able to pass something which is not completely opposed by one party. Like partial opposition will happen every single time with any law you bring about. You'll never have 100% satisfaction for everyone. So maybe focusing in that direction could lead us to getting something that protects all of these people.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Amisha. So I would actually like to draw a conclusion to this roundtable now. This has been a very productive one, and we have seen quite a lot of aspects as to data itself, and not just surveillance capitalism and the legal frameworks that already exist, as well as what can possibly exist in the near future and the realities of the same. So again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining, and thank you, and conclude this. So see you next month.